The wind howled through the crevices of the limestone cliffs in Blackwood Valley, carrying the sweltering heat of the Arizona desert, a dry air that felt ready to sear the lungs of any creature daring to draw a deep breath. Jedidiah Jed Cross sat on a jagged overhang, his lead-gray eyes scanning a horizon choked with dust and haze. He wasn't waiting for anything. He was just drawing breath. At 34, Jed had the build of a weather-beaten cactus, prickly, gnarled, and seemingly bled dry of every tear in exchange for survival. Below him, the valley stretched out like a gaping wound across the earth. Jed took a pull of rockgut from an old leather flask, the harsh taste of cheap barley making him wince. He patted his breast pocket, where he kept a crumpled newspaper clipping he'd cut out last week in Dust Creek. It was the Lonely Hearts column, a place where outlaws of the West and women from the East tried to find a spark of warmth amidst the cold reality of a drifter's life. Jed never thought he'd end up as part of that tattered scrap of paper. He'd been a mercenary, a man whose hands had spilled so much blood they never stopped shaking at night, unless he was gripping the handle of a Colt 45. His past was a blur of war cries and double crosses. He had chosen Blackwood as his hole-up because it was a place without hope, and a man without hope can be let down. You plan on sitting there until you turn to stone, Jed. Barnaby Old Bar stepped out from the low-slung blacksmith shack behind him. This one-eyed old horse puncher was the only soul in this god-forsaken land who dared call Jed by his name without fearing a bullet. Old Bar limped over, his calloused hand rubbing a stubbly silver chin as he looked out where Jed was staring. "Just counting how many vultures are waiting for me to kick the bucket," Jed replied, his voice as coarse as grinding stones. "Vultures only eat carrion. You're still breathing, even if it's the breath of a man digging his own grave." Old Bar chuckled. "You believe in reaping what you sow, Jed. Everything you do is a seed. You've planted enough thorns. Why not try sowing something else for a change?" Jed didn't answer. He stood up, knocking the dust off his worn leather breeches. The next morning, Jed rode his scraggly bay horse into Dust Creek. He stopped in front of the local newspaper office, a cramped room smelling of ink and fresh newsprint. The editor eyed Jed warily, noticing the iron on his hip. "I want to place an ad," Jed said, dropping $3 onto the desk. He hesitated for a moment, feeling like he was putting his head in the noose for folks to laugh at. Finally, he ground out the words onto the rough paper in large, jagged script. "Jedidiah Cross, 34 years old, Arizona cowboy. I live alone and got nothing but a skinny horse in a log cabin on a hill. Looking for a woman who ain't afraid of hard times and doesn't know how to lie to trade letters with. I ain't promising nothing, 'cause this land's got nothing to promise. Anyone wanting the truth, write me." The editor looked at the ad dry as a piece of dead wood, shrugged, and pocketed the cash. "It'll be in the morning edition." Jed stepped outside and headed toward Hell's Door Saloon. He picked a corner in the shadows, eyes locked on the entrance, the habit of a man constantly looking over his shoulder. In the corner of the bar, 3 men were tormenting a skin-and-bone stray dog, tying tin cans to its tail and laughing like hyenas. Jed tightened his grip on his glass. He saw the plea in the animal's eyes. It was just like him, alone and cornered. "Let the dog go," Jed spoke up. His voice cut through the noise like an arrow. The 3 men stopped. The fat ringleader looked at Jed with pure spite. "This your business, drifter?" "I won't say it twice." Jed stood up, hands hanging loose, thumb hovering over his holster. A deadly silence filled the saloon. The big man looked into Jed's hollow gray eyes, the eyes of a man with nothing left to lose. He huffed, gave the dog one last hard kick, and spat on the floor. "Hell, consider yourself lucky." The dog vanished into the darkness. Jed didn't know that this small act had begun to turn the gears of fate in his life. At the same time, in bustling Philadelphia, Ilara Vance was holding her breath behind a train station. Her expensive blue silk dress was now caked in mud. She heard the thud of leather boots on the cobblestones outside. She couldn't have gone far. "Thorne wants that map," a voice snarled. Ilara clutched her small bag. Inside was her father's notebook, a master jeweler, who had been murdered by Malachi Snake Eyes Thorne because he believed the old man held the secret to a silver mine. Ilara had been on the run for 2 weeks. She slipped into an abandoned newspaper office to hide. At her feet, a small ad in a Western paper caught her eye. A woman who ain't afraid of hard times and doesn't know how to lie. I ain't promising nothing. The name Jediah Cross sounded like an axe hitting wood. In a world forward, Thorne's deadly sweet talk, this raw bluntness, felt safe. With the steady hands of a jeweler's daughter, she picked up her broken pencil and wrote, Mr. Jediah Cross. I have known the taste of poverty, and I would sooner choose it over the bloody lies I am running from. I do not need you to promise me anything, only that you have enough lead to defend the truth. I am headed west. If you are truly as tight-lipped as you wrote, wait for me at Blackwood. Alara Vance. The next morning, Alara used her last coins to buy a steerage ticket, disguising herself as a poor widow with a black veil. As the train pulled out, she saw Thorne standing on the platform, his cold eyes scanning the crowd. 2 weeks later in Blackwood, Jed received the letter. He stood before Old Bar's forge, holding the paper that carried a strange strength. Any news from heaven? Old Bar asked. Not heaven, Jed whispered. It's a call from a place just as hell-bent as my own life. What are you going to do? Jed looked at his calloused hands. I'm going to build her a storm cellar bar. A place where the dust storms and those eastern bastards can't find their way in. Jed began working like a man possessed on the peak of Cross Hill, a spot with a 5-mile view to keep watch. He hauled field stones and pine timber alone, his back blistered and hands bleeding. He wrote back to her, Alara, this place is nothing but dust and cactus. I'm putting up a stone shack on the hill. If you're really coming, bring a good pair of boots. This ain't no place for silk shoes. Alara read the letter at a whistle stop in Texas. She smiled. Jediah, I threw the silk shoes in the trash a long time ago. I'm wearing a stagecoach driver's leather boots now. Keep that fire burning. I'm almost there. But Alara didn't know Malacca Thorne had picked up the scent. He had hired the Snake Eye Hounds, notorious hired guns, and they were riding hard for Blackwood. The smell of kerosene and coal dust from the western line still clung to Alara's black hem as she stepped onto the platform at Dust Creek. The Arizona wind slapped her face with a handful of grit, dry and scorching, as if intent on stripping away the last of her blue blood veneer. Alara squinted. Blackwood wasn't a town. It was a collection of rotting timber abandoned in the middle of the high desert. She gripped her frayed valise, where the silver mine map was sewn into the lining, and took a long drag of the parched air. No one was there to meet her. Jed had written that he wouldn't be at the station. He was busy framing the door for the shack on the hill, and didn't want his bags of bones horse hauling 2 people all that way, just for what he called useless pleasantries. If she really wanted to be there, she had to find her own way to Cross Hill. It was the first test. Alara stepped into the town's only general store. A pot-bellied man in a filthy apron chewing tobacco sized her up with a shady grin. I'm looking for Jediah Cross, Alara said, her voice raspy from thirst but still carrying a note of pride. The man spat a glob of black juice onto the floorboards. That lone wolf, you the woman who's been riding him. He's up on that god-forsaken mound, waiting to see if you peter out before you hit the top. Just follow this trail. When you see the ridge with 3 dead trees looking like crosses, you're there. Alara turned on her heel, ignoring the man's gut laugh behind her. She started walking. The leather boots she'd borrowed from a teamster back in Texas began to gnaw at her heels. But she didn't stop. With every step she repeated the name, Jedidiah Cross. She needed his ruggedness now more than ever, because that kind of grit was the only thing that didn't know how to lie. The sun began to dip, bleeding red across the distant Badlands. By the time Alara reached the foot of Cross Hill, the shadows had taken over. At the summit, a small flickering fire glowed between gray stone walls. She clawed her way past cactus thickets, her hands, once meant only for embroidery, now bloody and raw from the thorns. When she finally stood before the crude wooden door with a buckhorn handle, her lungs felt like they were on fire. She knocked. 3 heavy thuds. The door creaked open. A tall man stood there, blocking the light from the hearth behind him. Jed Cross looked older than 34, with a thick dark beard and gray eyes as sharp as a freshly honed blade. He didn't smile, and he didn't reach out to help her. He just stood there, taking in her beaten-down appearance. You're 2 hours late from the train, Jed said, his voice deep and gravelly. I had to hoof it, Alara panted. and I had to dodge a few no-goods in town. Jed's lip hitched slightly, a movement that barely passed for a smile. He stepped aside to let her in. Inside the stone shack, the air was thick with the smell of fresh-cut pine and simmering bean soup. The furnishings were sparse: a rough table, 2 stools, and a wooden bed frame against the wall. But one thing caught Elara's eye: on the stone windowsill. The dried wildflower Jed had mentioned in his letter sat right where he'd placed it. "Eat," Jed said, pushing a bowl of soup toward her. "Tomorrow you learn how to haul water from the creek 2 miles out. There ain't no fancy pants service here." Elara gripped the wooden spoon and looked him dead in the eye. "I didn't come here to be a lady, Jed. I came here to live." That night, Elara slept on the lone wooden bed while Jed curled up in a bearskin rug by the fire, his Colt 45 always within reach. The silence of the desert at night was haunting, so vast you could hear the sand shifting through the rock crevices. Elara looked up at the pine ceiling, feeling the sturdiness of the walls Jed had built. For the first time in months, she didn't hear the rhythmic thud of the Philadelphia thug's boots, but she knew they were still out there. And she was right. 10 miles east of Blackwood, Malachi Snake Eyes Thorne sat in a private luxury rail car. He toyed with the gold ring on his finger, his cold eyes fixed on a map of the Arizona Territory. "Mr. Thorne, we've confirmed where she jumped off," a man with a scar across his face, the leader of the hounds, reported with a nod. "She headed for Blackwood Valley. Sounds like some cowboy took her into a shack up on a hill." Thorne gave a thin, bloodless smile. "A cowboy? How poetic. Pity silver doesn't grow out of love. Let them have a few days of their honeymoon. Then I want them both bringing that map to me on their knees. If the cowboy gets salty, show him why they call you the hounds." The next 2 weeks on Cross Hill were a brutal masterclass in survival. Jed taught Elara how to handle a Winchester, how to milk a goat, and how to smell a dust storm on the wind. He remained a man of few words, but Elara began to see the cracks in his iron-clad exterior. She noticed him quietly sliding her the larger portion of jerky at dinner, and saw him standing watch on the porch through gale-force winds just so she could sleep soundly. One afternoon, as Elara was trying to plant some wild seeds by the stone wall, Jed walked up. He looked at her rough, calloused hands and unexpectedly took one in his. "Your father was a jeweler, wasn't he?" Jed asked, his thumb tracing her knuckles. "He was. He could turn raw ore into art," Elara said softly. "Thorne killed him for a piece of art he believed was a map to a silver strike. Is the map real?" Elara was silent for a moment, then pulled the tattered scrap of parchment from her bodice. "This is it, but my father said its value wasn't in the silver. It was in something else Thorne would never understand." Jed took the paper, glancing at the strange symbols. He sighed and handed it back. "Tuck it away. In these parts, that paper is a death warrant. I don't want to build a home on a silver mine. I just want a piece of dirt no one else gives a damn about." "Why did you put that ad in, Jed?" Elara asked, her eyes searching his. "You don't seem like the type who needs a woman around." Jed turned away, looking out over the valley. "I got tired of only seeing my own shadow on the sand. Barr was right, a man who lives only for himself isn't worth the dust he's made of. I wanted to see if I still had enough left in me to protect someone. Either I save you, or I die trying." Both beat sitting here, turning into a fossil. That raw honesty shook Elara to her core. She realized they weren't just two souls finding love. They were two drowning ghosts, grabbing onto each other just to breathe. Fate usually strikes when you finally feel at peace. On a morning where thick fog blanketed the valley, Jed sensed something was off. His horse was skittish in the corral, and the stray dog he'd saved, now filled out and loyal to the hill, began barking ferociously toward the canyon pass. "Get inside, Elara. Bolt the door and grab the Winchester," Jed ordered, his voice hard as nails. "What is it?" "The hounds are here. I can smell the gun oil on the wind." Jed scrambled onto the roof of the shack, where he'd built a narrow sighting slit. In the distance, 6 riders were slowly picking their way up the hill. The scarred man led the pack, holding a white flag in one hand while the other hovered over his 6-shooter. Jed didn't wait for them to speak. He leveled his Winchester and put a round right at the lead horse's hooves. The crack echoed through the valley, signaling that the dance had started. "Hold it right there, you bastards. Jed roared. Cross Hill don't take uninvited guests. The scarred man halted, a smirk playing on his face as he eyed the stone fortress. Jedidiah Cross, we got no beef with you. Hand over the girl in the paper, and Mr. Thorne will give you enough gold to leave this rock hole and live like a king in California. Thorne's gold is too dirty for my boots, Jed replied, his voice ice cold. Move along before I stop aiming for the dirt and start aiming for your thick skull. Well then, good luck in your stone coffin, the scarred man signaled his crew. Immediately, the 5 other gunmen fanned out, taking cover behind the boulders at the base of the hill. A hail of gunfire began to tear apart the silence of Cross Hill. Bullets whistled through the air, slamming into the gray stone walls and kicking up white dust. Inside, Alara sat with her back against the timber, gripping the rifle. She was shaking not out of a fear of dying, but a fear of Jed falling. She knew she couldn't just sit there. Remembering what Jed had taught her, Alara watched through a narrow rear window. She spotted a man trying to scale the sheer cliff behind the house, a blind spot for Jed. He had a knife in his teeth and a pistol at his hip, moving like a shadow. Alara took a deep breath, holding it until her hand stilled. She rested the barrel on the sill and aimed right at the dark shape cresting the ridge. Crack! A gut-wrenching scream followed as the man tumbled into the abyss. On the roof, Jed heard Alara's shot and gave a small nod. She wasn't a Philadelphia lady anymore. She was part of the fort. The battle raged until dusk. Jed picked off 2 more, but a bullet grazed his shoulder, soaking his faded shirt in red. The hounds temporarily pulled back to the base of the hill to wait for nightfall. They knew Jed couldn't watch every angle once the sun went down. Jed climbed down into the shack, face smeared with grime and black powder. Alara rushed to him, using a strip of her old dress to bind the wound. We can't stay here, Jed, Alara whispered. Thorne will just bring more men. This house will become our grave. Jed looked at the home he'd bled and sweated for. It hurt, but his head was clear. You're right, the dark is our only friend now. We're going through the Badlands. It's the only place city slickers like Thorne are too yellow to step into. But the Badlands are a death trap, Alara said, worried. No water, no food, just burning sand. I'd rather die by the desert's hand than crawl at Thorne's feet. Jed squeezed her hand. But before we go, I'm going to show them the truth about that silver. Jed took the letters Alara had written him, along with some gunpowder and a few scraps of fool's gold he'd found at Bar's forge. He placed them in a wooden box on the table, right in the center of the room. He wanted Thorne to find nothing but the ashes of their words and a big middle finger from a man who wasn't afraid anymore. At midnight, under the cover of a small Arizona blessing, a rising dust storm, the 2 of them slipped away from Cross Hill on the lone skinny horse. They headed toward the vast Badlands, where the deep red rock pillars looked like the devil's fingers pointing at the sky. When the hounds stormed the hill the next morning, all they found was an empty stone shell. On the table, Jed's final note was scrawled in charcoal. The only truth here is dust. Want silver? Ask the desert. Miles away, Jed and Alara were facing their greatest test. The water was gone, and the horse was starting to buckle. But in the searing heat of the Badlands, Jed suddenly stopped. He saw a strange print in the sand, not a leather boot, but a small barefoot track. Hold on, Jed whispered. Karma's calling. He followed the tracks into a narrow crevice and found a native child curled up, his legs swollen from a rattlesnake bite. Alara didn't hesitate. She knelt down, using the herbal knowledge her father had taught her to treat the boy. Jed stood guard, the gun in his hand no longer pointed at an enemy, but held for the sake of a life. He didn't know then that this act would save their necks in the days to come, but in that moment, watching Alara tend to the child in the middle of a dead zone, Jed knew he'd found the most valuable silver mine he'd ever known. Alara used a small knife, heated over a flickering candle flame, to skillfully pierce the blackened wound on the boy's calf. Toxic pus and dark blood oozed out, carrying the pungent stench of rattlesnake venom. The child, about 7 years old and bronzed by the sun, groaned in a delirium but kept his eyes clamped shut. Jed knelt beside them, his calloused hands pinning the boy's shoulders to keep him from thrashing. He watched Alara, a woman once accustomed to handling Philadelphia's finest jewels, now kneeling in the dirt, drenched in sweat, using her own hymn to wipe the blood from a stranger's child. "What are you doing?" "We ain't got the time," Jed whispered, his eyes never leaving the mouth of the crevice. "If we leave him, he's a dead man before sundown," Alara replied, her voice steady. She pulled a handful of dried herbs from a small pouch bits she'd scavenged along the trail, chewed them into a pulp, and pressed them onto the wound. "My father said silver is just dead stone, but a life is the only ore you can dig up twice. We aren't outrunning Thorn by stepping over a child's corpse." Jed went silent. He looked out in the hazy shimmer of the Badlands. He killed men before, seen brothers in arms fall, and once believed that compassion was a death sentence in the territories. But seeing the boy settle, his breathing leveling out, Jed felt something in his chest thaw. It wasn't weakness. It was a new kind of iron, forged from protecting life rather than taking it. They holed up in the crevice for another 2 hours. When the sun hit its peak, turning the Badlands into a massive furnace, a tall figure appeared at the cave entrance. Jed's hand blurred to his side, finger tensed on the trigger, but he froze. It was an Apache man, his face etched with deep lines like riverbeds in stone. He wasn't packing a heat. He held only a long spear and stared at the boy in Alara's lap. His gaze shifted from Jed's iron to Alara's bloody herb-stained hands. The tension, thick enough to cut, broke when the man lowered his spear and gave a short nod. "We're just passing through," Jed said in the broken Spanish he'd picked up during his hitch in the service. "Snake bit the boy. She saved him." The man said nothing. He stepped forward, gathered the child in his arms, and signaled for Jed and Ilara to follow. They had no choice. Their lone horse had given up the ghost at the cave entrance. Now the desert was their biggest enemy, and this man looked like their only prayer. They moved deep into a labyrinth of canyons where towering cliffs choked out the direct sun. Jed noticed the scout's trailcraft. He always stepped on hard pan to leave no prints, and occasionally used the branch to brush away scuff marks. These were the movements of a ghost. After nearly 3 hours of winding through the rocks, they reached a small camp tucked behind a massive overhang, where a hidden spring trickled from a fissure. Ilara collapsed by the cool water, splashing her face like a dying woman brought back to life. The Apache man led them to a hide tent, motioning for them to rest, and brought out some jerky and fresh water. "Why are they helping us?" Ilara whispered after the man left. "Karma," Jed replied shortly, cleaning his Colt. "You save their kin, they give us water. In this country, that's the squarest deal I've ever seen." But the peace didn't hold. The next morning, standing watch from a high ledge, Jed saw gray smudges of smoke rising from the direction of Cross Hill. Malachi Thorne had lost his patience. He torched the stone shack. The fire had jumped to the dry brush, creating a pillar of smoke like a cold declaration of war against the sky. "Thorne isn't just after the map anymore," Jed said, returning to the tent with a dark look on his face. "He wants to wipe us off the slate. The hounds are closing in. Some Judas in this camp slipped out last night. I'd wager he's trading our location for gold." Alara stood up, adjusting her satchel. "We have to move. I won't drag these people into my fight." "Where to?" "Up ahead is Whitebone Valley, no way out unless you know how to fly," Jed snapped. But then he saw the Apache man from yesterday waiting for them outside. The man handed Jed 2 sturdy mounts and pointed toward a narrow, vertical trail hugging the cliffside. "The spirit path," he said in pidgin English. "The enemy won't see. Move fast, move fast." They left immediately. The trail was so narrow that one misstep meant a 1,000-foot drop. Alara gripped the horse's mane, eyes shut tight as they navigated the crumbling ledges. Jed brought up the rear, Winchester at the ready. He felt the heat of the Badlands give way to the chill of deep canyons where the sun never touched the floor. By midday, the thud of hooves and shouting began to echo from the valley floor. Malachi Thorne had arrived. He stood on an opposing ledge, his black velvet coat looking ridiculous in the wild. Through his rifle sights, Jed could see Thorne's face pale, eyes slitted like a viper's, full of disgust and greed. "Jediah Cross," Thorne's voice boomed through the rocks, amplified by the canyon walls. "You're holding on to something that don't belong to you. Hand over the girl, and I promise you a quick end." Otherwise, I'll let the hounds skin you inch by inch under the sun. Jed didn't answer with words. He answered with lead. The bullet slammed into the rock right at Thorne's feet, sending him scrambling back in a rage. "Light 'em up," Thorne screamed. The firefight exploded. Thorne's hounds had the numbers, but Jed and Alara had the high ground. They ducked behind limestone boulders, returning fire with lethal precision. Alara had changed. She no longer closed her eyes when she pulled the trigger. She aimed for the gaps in the rocks where the gunmen tried to advance. However, Malachi Thorne wasn't a fool. He ordered his men to use black powder, the kind used for mining. Boom! An explosion rocked the earth. A section of the cliff above the trail collapsed, boulders raining down like hail, blocking Jed and Alara's escape. Dust and smoke filled the air, leaving them coughing and blind. "We're penned," Alara shouted over the gunfire. Jed looked around desperately. Rubble in front, killers behind, a cliff to the left, and an abyss to the right. In that final moment, Jed looked at Alara's bag. "Give me the map," Jed barked. "You're going to give it to him," Alara gasped. "No, I got a plan. Trust me." Alara looked into Jed's gray eyes. She saw they weren't hollow anymore. They were burning with a desperate hope. She ripped the lining of her bag and handed him the tattered parchment. Jed wrapped it around a piece of fool's gold he brought from the hill, stuffed in some extra powder, and tied it tight. "Thorne, you want this damn thing." Jed stood tall on the ledge, hoisting the treasure high. The shooting stopped. Malachi Thorne stepped to the edge, his eyes glowing with pure avarice. "Toss it over, cowboy, and I might let you breathe another day. Come and get it." Jed wound up and hurled the pouch toward a jagged outcrop in the middle of the abyss, right where a natural sinkhole was hidden by a thin layer of dust, a piece of terrain only a desert rat would recognize. The pouch landed perfectly. Malachi Thorne couldn't help himself. He shoved his men aside, lunging for that outcrop. To him, that silver mine was his only out for his massive eastern debts. It was ultimate power. He forgot his caution. He forgot the rules of the desert. The moment Thorne's boot hit the ledge, the crust gave way. He let out a blood-curdling scream as he realized his legs were being sucked into a bottomless sand trap. The more he thrashed, the faster the desert swallowed him. "Help me, you idiots, help me!" The hounds moved to charge, but Jed opened fire to keep them back. "Anyone moves is going down with him." In a frenzy, Thorne clawed at the silver pouch. He tore it open, but instead of the key to a fortune, he found only Alara's old letters to Jed and a hunk of worthless rock. The powder inside caught a spark from the cigar Thorne still had clamped in his teeth, blowing the last scrap of parchment to ash right in front of his face. "No, my map! My silver!" Thorne's face twisted in agony and madness. The sand was up to his chest. He looked up at the opposing ledge and saw Jed with his arm around Alara. They stood there, tall against the golden sun, watching him vanish into nothing. Thorne realized too late that the silver mine never existed in the dirt. It lived in the souls of the people he looked down on. He died by the very greed trap he'd spent his life setting for others. Seeing their boss go under, the hounds lost their nerve and skedaddled as Apache warriors appeared on the surrounding ridges. The battle ended in the eerie silence of the desert. Jed and Alara sat down by the ruins. Jed had a slug in his bicep, blood soaking his shoulder, but he was wearing a grin. "You played him," Alara said, her voice shaking with relief. "That paper, was it ever the mat?" "No." Jed shook his head. He pulled another paper from his back pocket, smaller and older. "This is the real deal. Your father hid it in that buckhorn door handle he gave me back when I was a hired gun. I found it when I was building the place on Cross Hill. But he told me, only open it when you find a reason to live." Jed unfolded the paper. Alara held her breath, expecting a massive strike location. But there was only one line of elegant handwriting. "To whoever finds this, silver only brings enemies. Love brings a family. The real mine is the place you're willing to sweat to build a home." Alara broke down in tears. She leaned her head on Jed's shoulder, watching the gold dust dance in the air. They hadn't found a fortune, but they'd found each other in a dead land. Led by their Apache friends, they found a secret pass out of Whitebone Valley. As they stepped out of the Badlands, they were met by a glorious sunrise over the green plains of the Texas border. Jed looked at Alara, his eyes no longer lead-colored, but bright with a steely resolve. "Where are we going, Jed?" "Home," Jed said, his voice unusually warm. "This time I ain't building a stone hole. I'm building a house with plenty of windows, so you can see the sun come up every day without having to fear a damn thing." They spurred their horses toward the horizon, leaving the echoes of the harsh land and their bloody pasts behind. They rode toward a new life where karma had finally smiled on the souls who chose mercy over hate, where every footprint in the sand was no longer a sign of a flight, but the beginning of a long trail called family. Under the guidance of Old Bar, they found a small valley tucked away behind zigzagging canyons where a thin underground spring trickled from a rock fissure. It was a path for ghosts. Barnaby Old Bar chuckled, pulling out a plug of chewing tobacco. "You plan on sitting there until you turn to stone, Jed? This land's got nothing to promise. Anyone wanting the truth, write me." Jed knew Old Bar was right. His mercenary past was stained with too much blood. He patted his breast pocket, where he kept a crumpled newspaper clipping he cut out last week in Dust Creek. It was the Lonely Hearts column, a place where outlaws of the West and women from the East tried to find a spark of warmth amidst the cold reality of a drifter's life. He never thought he'd end up as part of that tattered scrap of paper. But as he watched Alara splash her face in the underground spring, drinking like a dying woman brought back to life, Jed knew he had found a reason to live. He didn't want her running anymore. He wanted to build her a home, a real roof over her head. He looked at his calloused, scarred hands. For the first time in 10 years, he felt a jolt of electricity run down his spine. "We're building here," Jed said, his gaze flashing with a steely light for the first time. "There's nothing here for greedy bastards to eye. I'll show her the raw truth of this land, and if she stays, only then will I believe in that karma Bar is always jawing about." They began working like men possessed. Jed hauled heavy timber up the hill alone, his back blistered and hands bleeding. Elara kneaded mud and dry straw to make sun-dried bricks. Hands once meant for embroidery grew rough from the heavy lifting. Old Bar helped them wrangle horses and raise the corrals. The stray dog Jed had saved at the saloon now filled out, and Loyal stayed close by, barking a warning at any strange shadow. The stone house slowly took shape, rugged but built to last. It wasn't pretty, but it was sturdier than any mansion in Philadelphia. On the long while, cell overlooking the valley, Elara placed a dried wildflower, the one Jed had mentioned in his letter. It was a reminder of his raw honesty, the very thing that had shaken her to the core. But life on the frontier was never a cakewalk. The parched valley was nothing but dust and cactus. The water source was a 2-mile trek. The brutal winters brought a chill that could cut right to the bone. Alara had to learn how to handle a Winchester, how to milk a goat, and how to smell a dust storm on the wind. There were nights she sat with her back against the timber, gripping her rifle, listening to the haunting silence of the desert night. One afternoon, as she was trying to plant wild seeds by the stone wall, Jed walked up. He looked at her rough, calloused hands and unexpectedly took one in his. "Your father was a jeweler, wasn't he?" "He was. He could turn raw ore into art," Ella said softly. "Thorne killed him for a piece of art he believed was a map to a silver strike." "Is the map real?" Alara was silent for a moment, then pulled the tattered scrap of parchment from her bodice. "This is it, but my father said its value wasn't in the silver. It was in something else Thorne would never understand." Jed took the paper, glancing at the strange symbols. He sighed and handed it back. "Tuck it away. In these parts, that paper is a death warrant. I don't want to build a home on a silver mine. I just want a piece of dirt no one else gives a damn about." That raw honesty shook Alara to her core. She realized they weren't just two souls finding love. They were two drowning ghosts, grabbing onto each other just to breathe. Karma usually strikes when you finally feel at peace. On a morning where thick fog blanketed the valley, Jed sensed something was off. Thorne's hounds had found them. The final showdown began with the crack of a Winchester echoing through the canyon. Jed and Alara ducked behind massive boulders, returning fire with lethal precision. Alara aimed right at a dark shape cresting the ridge. A gut-wrenching scream followed as the gunman tumbled into the abyss. In a moment of desperation, Jed looked at Alara's bag. Give me the map. He wrapped the paper round a piece of fool's gold, stuffed in some extra powder, and held it high. Thorn, you want this damn thing? Come and get it. He hurled the pouch toward a jagged outcrop in the middle of the abyss, right where a natural sand trap lay hidden. Malachi Thorn couldn't help himself. He lunged for it. The moment Thorn's boot hit the ledge, the crust gave way. He let out a blood-curdling scream as he realized his legs were being sucked into a bottomless pit of quicksand. The powder inside ignited, blowing a last scrap of parchment to ash right before his eyes. Thorn's face twisted in agony and madness. He died by the very greed trap he'd spent his life setting for others. The battle ended in the eerie silence of the desert. The hounds skedaddled as Apache warriors appeared on the surrounding ridges. Jed recognized the Apache leader as the father of the boy bitten by the rattlesnake. He was one of the Apache friends who had waited for them outside the narrow crevice when Jed and Alara found the child. He gave Jed two sturdy mounts and pointed toward a steep trail along the cliffside. The spirit path, he said in pidgin English. The enemy won't see. Move fast. This act of reaping what they sowed had saved their necks. Jed Cross didn't kill for the thrill of it anymore, but to protect life and atonement for his bloody mercenary past. He looked at Alara, his eyes no longer weed-colored, but bright with a steely resolve. The Badlands had washed his soul clean. Money was a ghost. Only love brought a family. Years later, Jed's cabin had become a fixture of the valley, surrounded by green pastures and a growing herd. Barnaby, old Bar, had passed on, but before the one-eyed old horse puncher drew his last breath, he lived to see Jed sow a little mercy into the parched earth. Greed had led Malachi Thorn to a lonely grave, but compassion had opened a path for Jed and Alara to a full life, with a house full of kin. The children often asked about the letters, the manhunt, and the silver mine that never was. That right there is the real silver mine, Jed would say, pointing toward the house filled with laughter. It's the place a man is willing to sweat for to build a home.